Hello, everyone. My name is Ayush Jain. Welcome to the webinar for launching new products at Product School. Thanks for joining me today. I'll talk a little bit about myself to begin with, and then we'll get right into the key takeaways for this session. Very quick introduction about me. I'm currently a PM leader at Microsoft, and I have a small team of product managers, and we are shipping a marketing automation tool. I have about 10 years in big tech, including companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon. And I've been fortunate to be part of product life cycles or product teams at different stages in the product life cycle. From my days on the Visual Studio business at Microsoft, which is a cash cow worth billions. And I helped grow that business by 1 million active users in the 1 year I was there. And I worked at Amazon, where I was on Amazon Redshift, which was competing with a company called Snowflake that recently IPO'd and was facing increasing competitive pressure. I helped ship the 3 features that closed that competitive gap and grew the monthly active usage by 18%. And then finally, early stage products at Microsoft. And my second stint here, since the last 2 years, I've conceived 2 new product ideas, and we're shipping one of them next year. So it's this latter experience that has been, for me, the most rewarding. And there's a lot of content out there on how companies do early stage thinking and how to launch startups or how to present your idea to investors, but not so much about how you think about that creative process or early stage process in big tech companies. So I wanted to share my learnings as I went through this process with you today. There's essentially 3 things I want to share with you. Number one, how can you identify and validate problems to solve and scope a market opportunity? And this is based on ambiguous problems that you would be thrown at, as a product manager. And I want to make sure that you have the tools to think about how to get from that ambiguous problem into something more concrete and be able to actually drive something to conception and then to execution and then all the way through to the market. The second thing I want to talk about is, when you're presented with an opportunity, which is quite rare, but does happen, of presenting to senior leaders and getting your idea greenlit, how do you make that effective? And how do you make sure that you take all the work you've done and make that a starting point of something great? And the third thing I want to talk about is just execution and just execution excellence, which is a skill that every PM relies on. And so I want to give you tools again to think about how you can rally your team to execute against a high quality and on time criteria to take your idea to market and then validate product market fit. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing we're talking about is finding opportunity. An example here of when I was faced with this problem was when I joined Microsoft again, my second time at Microsoft. My GM basically said, I have a business currently, and the business was in HR tool space, and we want to exit this business. We have some brand rationalization happening inside the company, and some other team is going to take up this business, which basically means that I need to find a new business for my team or a new product for that matter. So I need you, Ayush, to do that for the team. And I need you to come up with that business opportunity. Now, you could be, as a PM, you could face a similar issue in an existing business that, let's say, wants to grow explosively. You could have a business that's already making $1 billion, but your leadership might say, hey, I want to find an opportunity to grow that by an additional $1 billion in the next 2 years, which is a pretty ambitious goal. Or you could have a pretty ambiguous problem saying, hey, we want to enter this new market that we have not been in. So how would you go and think about that? So the same frame or the same kind of techniques can be applied across those different domains. Okay, so how do you think about it? So when you start with such an ambiguous prompt that is given to you by the leadership, you basically have to think about 2 aspects for sure. And you can think about more as well, but these are the 2 critical ones. You think about the customer problem and the business problem, right? So when you think about the customer, you always start with who you think is the imagined customer and trying to define that customer as well as you can. An example of this would be that if your business or if your product line serves, let's say, data analysts, how do you think about this ambiguous problem you're presented with? You can either start with a customer you're already serving, or you can start with aligned customers. For example, data engineers. who might be interacting with the direct customer that you have been serving so far and might have unmet needs. So really think about like the starting point being your existing customer base, and then how can you think about adjacent use cases or adjacent scenarios and which personas that affects. So think about those as your imagined customer, and then try to build an empathy map for these customers. So really think about who they are, what they feel, what they do when they're trying to get a job done. What are some of their pain points? What are some of their motivations? Try to just put yourself in the shoes of that end customer that you have imagined, and try to get like empathy through that. This tool, the Empathy Map Canvas, is pretty readily available on Google. There's other templates as well that you can use, but this is a great starting point when you're trying to build that empathy map. It also helps you just align with some other members of the team who may be helping you and build a shared understanding of who you think the customer is. Right. So when you have the customer problem defined, you want to think about the business problem. You want to think about, what is the business goal you're trying to achieve. This business goal could be, as I said, expanding existing businesses or finding new revenue streams. It could be a strategic investment that your team wants to make to strengthen the existing business, or it could just be a net new business or net new product that you want to launch. So think about that and work backwards from it, because it's really that goal that would influence what you do and how you do it. Similarly, think about what levers does your company have to achieve these goals. I think as product managers, we have a knack for just jumping at product thinking. For example, when faced with the problem of how do you expand existing businesses. But think about other aspects of your company. Think about your sales team, your marketing team, your operations team. Can you just use those levers to get to the business goal that was stated? For example, if you have to double the revenue, do you really need to launch a new product to double the revenue? Instead of that, could you, in theory, just start a sales program or create a sales incentive that would just help you land the new business? So think holistically as a product manager, like we really own the business, and we have the opportunity to think about different ways of getting to a goal, which is sometimes not just a product. And then the third thing to think about is, does the company have core competencies that can be leveraged for the imagined customers, right? So if you are a company that specializes in, as I said, big data tools, you don't want to go into personas that live in mom and pop retailers or like small e-commerce shops, because they don't have big data in the first place, right? So even if you are thinking about unmet needs or pain points for those personas, you will have to create these core competencies from scratch, and your pitch could be dead in the water to start with. Okay, so how do we now go from this high-level framing of the problem into something that results in an idea, a tangible idea that you can take to market? So there's a pretty popular tool called the double diamond. This was a process that was popularized by the British Design Council in 2005. And a lot of companies use this formally. Some other companies just have more of an informal process, which kind of gets to the same in spirit. But essentially what this means is that you spend 2 cycles, one going pretty deep and broad on the problem space, and then converging into a succinct definition of the problem. And the second one doing the same on the solutioning side, going very broad into the solution space, imagining everything that's possible, and then coming up with the most promising solution at the end of it. And you're still not in build mode. You're still just ideating. So think about this as a high-level way to get from your ambiguous problem frame that you've put together to a more concrete problem, and then to a starting of a solution that your team can rally behind, right? So an example of this is, let's say you started with an ambiguous problem of this pain point of people who work long hours but want to spend more time with family and are somehow not able to do that. And that's the only thing you know about the problem. So you know about your target customer persona, you know about the problem, but that's not enough to go off of. You can start like going in many different directions with that framing of the problem. Really, the next step would be for you to like actually start doing that, to go broad on the problem itself without actually thinking about the solution just yet. And so you can, flesh out more personas that are kind of aligned. Like, who are the people who might work long hours? There would be people who are working remotely. There would be people who are commuting to their workplace. or they're just people who are doing labor-intensive jobs that require them to stay for long hours. And so for each of these personas, can you identify the pain points? And then can you validate those pain points to get to a converged definition? An example of that convergence could be that you said for people who commute by driving, you think they're unable to spend time with family due to the time they waste in daily trifles, like picking up morning coffee, filling up gas, and so on. And that is the problem that you want to go and solve, right? So that crisp definition of the problem gets you started with solutioning, and you can then start exploring the solution space broadly. And once again, using the core competencies that your company has, that your team has, come to a conclusion. And so, for example, you could be in a company that's already building voice-based applications for existing platforms, or it could be a company that's building a voice platform like Alexa, Cortana, or Google Home, or it could be a company that's even manufacturing, smart car systems. In all of those cases, you could think of a solution where a voice-based system in the car can eliminate that wasted time. And that could be your high level solution. But all of this actually results from a process that's data driven and that's structured. So let's talk about what that process could look like. So the first thing I talked about was going broad into the problem space and then converging into something you can actually solve. There's this spreadsheet that we used when we did this initially for the HR tools business. The spreadsheet basically has a bunch of customer segments, and it has problem hypotheses. And the way that we came up with these customer segments and hypotheses was we just did a 2 hour long workshop with like 4 or 5 people who were going to help out with this effort. And we sat together and identified, based on some intuition as well as some secondary research that we had done prior to the workshop, some of the jobs to be done for each of these personas. And then for these jobs to be done, we started identifying the pain points, where the customer is actually stuck. What are the things that are hard, or what are the things that they can actually not even do today because there's gaps. And we started documenting them in the spreadsheet as hypotheses. We then went off and divided and conquered. So like each one of us kind of just owned one persona. And we found people through LinkedIn, through our friends, through our network, who would resemble that persona. And we conducted phone interviews to get validation. So for each persona that would validate or invalidate the hypothesis, we would just kind of annotate that in the spreadsheet. And at the end of the day, like we would have a running total of how many validations or invalidations these hypotheses have had through those interviews. The other thing this helped us do is also find new hypotheses that we didn't have before by just talking to these customers. So this list was ever growing. It wasn't static throughout the process. We kept inputting more hypotheses as we came across them. And then we met at the end of the next 2 to 3 days or a week and just shared our findings and just debriefed. And through that, we were able to just kind of like stat rank the hardest hitting problems that we had found, namely the problems that had the most validations. And then we went and did some more digging on, collecting some real data through, industry forums, analyst forums, or just, research that has been published around those pain points as well. The next thing we did was to think about the addressable market opportunity. Now, it is one thing to have a really concrete customer pain point defined, but it's quite another to actually say that not only is it a pain point, but it actually has market opportunity which can sustain a business or a business model. So in doing so, we actually looked at 3 aspects. We looked at the industry. There's a pretty common tool that folks are taught in business schools, the Potter's 5 forces, which talk about the power that the market forces kind of exert upon a certain industry and whether that industry is then favorable to get into or not. For example, if the industry is such that it is commoditized and the pricing power is dictated by the buyers because there's so much supply, kind of like rice, you don't want to get into that industry because it's already too concentrated, or it's too hard to get into, or there's no pricing power, so you can't extract rents, as economists call it. That analysis is very useful to just get started on understanding that industry is compelling. And then you have to think about competition. Like, of course, it may be a pain point for customers, but if there's competitors that are already solving that pain point, what are they leaving on the table? What are they not doing well? And it may just be that the competitors are on the high end of the market, so it's affordable for the masses and it's a premium product. So there's a chance to do a mass market product, but you only know that with a competitive analysis. Look at VC investment. VCs who are investing in an idea kind of validate it for you. So if you see there's a bunch of startups that have VC investments in that space, that's a pretty good sign that there's some traction here. Similarly, think about the customer. You've done a pretty good job so far just thinking about the customer and the problems, but also think now about whether the problem is big enough that the customer is actually willing to pay for it, or is it just, something they don't think about proactively. You want to make sure that you can monetize your product in most cases, unless you're just building it for strategic purposes. And then think finally about the company. As I said, think about complementarity to existing offerings. Think about how big your team is. Are you coming up with an idea that can only support a team of like a few people, and you need to support like a team of 40, 50 people? This is not something that you would typically think about in startups because you can hire your team, but in big companies, sometimes your resources are already given, and you want to fit the idea to be big enough for those resources. And then think about the company's differentiated assets that could help you win in that market. Okay, so now that you've been through this process and you have a good understanding of your problem as well as a high-level solution to that problem, and then the monetizability or the market opportunity of it, it's all about landing this in the right way, presenting it to senior leaders who would essentially be the investors for your idea. And so just setting some ground rules when you go into that presentation, make sure that you keep it short. You plan to summarize everything in just 10 slides or fewer. And you are socializing that idea or the problem ahead of time with the senior leaders, direct reports. This is not the time to be selling to them as a group. This is the time for you and them together to be selling to the leader themselves. And then be prepared to wallow. Just make sure you know your stuff and be ready for any questions. And then let's actually think about the actual presentation as a 3-act play. So the first thing to know is that your VC, who could be your GM or your VP or whoever, is motivated first emotionally, and only then do they think about financial incentives or hard data. So really set the stage first. Clearly articulate the pain. Conflict is the driving force behind good storytelling. So by flipping a situation on its head, investors are compelled to lean forward and listen to how this conflict will be resolved. In movies, this dramatic trigger point is usually called an inciting incident or catalyst, or the moment where the character's life is thrown out of balance, propelling her on a quest to restore this balance, right? All movies have this turning point in the first 10 to 20% of the script. And this is a great storytelling tool for any senior leader presentation on your idea for a new feature, a new product, or new business. Bring data and anecdotes apart from just setting that problem. Bring data from your customer interviews, analyst forums, industry forums, and so on. The second thing is, as a product manager, we do have a tendency to jump to the solution right from, the problem, but there's an intermediate step here. You have to paint the vision of the world in which that problem has been solved. And when you think about that vision, talk about how it benefits your customers. Does it create, more time for your customers because it frees up some of the stuff that they had to manually do? Does it create a monetary benefit for your customer? Similarly, what is the motivation for your company? Does it create new revenue stream, or does it create strategic assets? That is the vision you want to paint. And then you want to talk about the how. Continuing with the theme of the Marvel movies, think about how in the Infinity War's first installment, they called Captain Marvel. And that's just the beginning of the solution to how they were going to solve the problem of Thanos having the Infinity Stones. So then talk about the solution in those 1 to 2 slides at a very high level, and then talk about your secret sauce or your competitive advantage. Talk about your beachhead for adoption. Who are the customers, the companies, the industries, the geos? And then thirdly, talk about any projections or any data that you have to show that this would result in the attainment of that goal that you had outlined, be it revenue or profits or whatever else. So that wraps up the three act kind of a way of presenting your idea to your senior leaders. Let's look at what happens if, let's say, you've done all this work and your idea is actually greenlit, and your execs say, go, 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 let's ship this product or launch this business. How you as a product manager can do that. And so there's essentially three steps to follow. First, make sure that you're selling your idea to the team, because to this point they may not have had exposure to your way of thinking, to the reasons you're recommending a few things, and the feedback or the customer interviews that have gone into it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is allow creativity to happen. And so, this is a unique opportunity for the team to come together and think from a wide space with no established products or nothing putting them down. But at the same time, there's a risk of creativity just creating a runaway effect where teams take very long in coming to a shippable increment, right? So you want to make sure that you create a process that allows that creativity to breathe because it's good. It will lead to innovation and a better way of delivering against the pain points you've identified. But also, the third thing is create a structured execution plan towards an MVP and aim to ship that MVP very quickly and get it in the hands of the customers so that they can validate what you're doing is actually solving for the pain points that you set out to solve. And so the ultimate goal here is to get product market fit as quickly as possible. And you won't get the momentum, obviously, unless you actually launch the product broadly into market. But by having an MVP that's validated by real customers in real scenarios, you would actually get increase or maximize your chances of making that happen later on. So how do we do that? We continue with a double diamond process, right? Like we basically now translate that process to work at a team or a feature squad level. So you might have a simple product, like let's start with a voice-based system example, which might have the app itself. It may have a voice interface where there are certain commands, and then it may have a set of actions that it takes based on those voice commands. And you may have different teams in your, different feature teams that would be doing one part each of this holistic idea that you have. And so what you can essentially do is, delegate this double diamond process throughout the team and have them think about specific pain points at each of those each of those different components of your imagined product, and then go again, ideate, go broad on those pain points, and then again come up with prototypes and solution ideas that they can then evaluate and learn from very quickly. And the best ideas from that evaluation stage, from the phase two stage, can then be fed into the product backlog. So think about like how that cadence would look like when the teams would go spend some time in the phase one ideating, just understanding the problem for their area, their vertical, and then very quickly get into prototyping stage, and then seed the best ideas into the phase three of ongoing development. And so phase one and two are more heavy on the PM and design side, and then phase three is heavy on the engineering side. Now, how do you do this? Like, how do you create the phase one and phase two as a PM in a way that gets those ideas flowing quickly and gets something under the hands of your developers, who, by the way, are probably waiting initially to get something to work on? And so the way that we did this, at Microsoft, was this 1 week design sprint or 1.5 week design sprint, where we started initially with just 4 to 5 people, with a few PMs, few designers, maybe a developer or two, and just wallowed on the problem. We basically use how might we statements for each of these problem framing stages for the design sprints, and came up with as much as secondary research and as much as primary research that we had already collected to make sure that the team had a shared understanding. We then spent a week just coming up with different solutions And we started that week with an exercise we call Crazy Eights, where we design 8 different ideas per person in the room for solving the problem that we have outlined, the how might we statement. And then we basically vote as a group on the best ideas that come up in that workshop. And then the UX designer basically takes some of the most promising ideas and converts them into low fidelity wireframes from just paper sketches. And then we spend a day critiquing those ideas, iterating on them, and basically then sharing the work out as well as testing it. So once we have the idea that looks promising, and once we have the points of validation we need for that idea, we spent a day or two just testing that concept with some of the personas or some of the customer personas that would be using it. Again, going back to our network, maybe going back to the same people we had talked to before, or finding new people through user testing, and then come back with the feedback and see if this is a promising idea based on all that feedback. Um, and then, the most promising ideas do go into the product backlog. They get broken out into user stories or features, and then the engineering team immediately can start working on those ideas. And then the team can go back to the front of this process, think about yet another problem space they want to solve for, and just do it asynchronously as the product gets into feature development. And then finally, deliver your MVP through these stages of prototyping, developing, and then customer feedback. So you want to get to MVP hopefully in just a few months, and not burn too much time in R&D before you get feedback. But at the same time, while you're doing it, make sure you're recruiting customers and advisors with real scenarios who will promise to become early adopters or testers of the MVP. Do that as soon as you have the product in designs. Like we have Figma that we use here at Microsoft, which helps us create designs we can shop around with prospective customers. And we basically use a Figma slideshow or a PowerPoint slideshow to show them what the product may look like, and just get their buy-in to be able to test the product. And then we ship the product very quickly, at least a small increment of it, and get customer feedback. And based on that feedback, you decide if you have to pivot or persevere and continue building in that direction. But this is really the checkpoint that will help you increase or maximize the chances that you will find product market fit down the road. And so that kind of wraps up all the content I had for you today. I just want to recap the takeaways here. The first one is, how do you identify and validate problems to solve when you're given a pretty ambiguous problem? We learned about problem framing using customer and business considerations. We talked about going broad in both the problem and solution space through the double diamond process. And then we talked about assessing market opportunity for the validated ideas or validated problems that have come through that process. We then talked about pitching your internal investors, who could be your GMs, VPs, or leaders, focusing on the emotional pitch before you bring the hard data, and then using the 3-act pitch, the Hollywood style pitch of the catalyst or the inciting incident, the vision that shows the world when everything is solved, and the solution, which is the how to get to that world. And then the third thing we talked about is, how do you fast track your execution to get the idea to market quickly and make sure you're on the way to your product market fit. And so in there, we talked about rapid prototyping. We talked about using design sprints. Then we talked about recruiting customers who will give feedback on the MVP. So hope that helps, and hope you can take away some of the lessons from it and apply them on a day-to-day basis as you think through your own product challenges.